All right, today we are going to learn how to take our mountain paintings up a notch. I did some practicing before I make the video to really get my own thoughts in order. So I want to just kind of show you what we're going to be talking about and practicing. So when you make mountains, they start very basic, right? They seem very flat. You can make beautiful scenes with just simple mountain shapes. But what I want to show you how to do is start adding these sides to the mountains. Start to make them look 3D and not just one color. So we'll talk about where to put those shadows. We'll talk about the lines to divide up the shadows from the highlights. We'll also talk about the direction of those marks and how they should go, because all of those things are going to impact how these make the mountains look 3D. And then you can put that into practice and really make any scene look that much more realistic by making these shadows on the mountain. So this is where we are going today. We're gonna be doing more like the practice little things. You can make your own masterpiece on your own, or maybe I'll have some tutorials in the future that are how to put this into a full landscape. But really, once you can do a little mountain like this, all you have to do is add a sky and a foreground and you are good to go. So let's get started. Okay, any mountain range when you start, you want to pick a light value. Now this could actually be white, in which case you'd paint the sky around the mountains, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I love cool colors for mountains. Blues, purples, browns even. I know they're neutral, but they're kind of muddy. Cool colors feel further away from us than warm colors do. So if you're making a landscape, things further away in general should be cooler than the things closer to you. So blues, purples, greens, those feel cooler. I'm gonna do kind of a light blue because it's classic. I like the way it looks. And what we're gonna start with is, first, I'm using a round brush today. This is a size 8. And I really will only need this brush for most of it. I might switch to a smaller brush once we get into those details. But I've got a very watery, bluish green on my paintbrush. And I'm going to use the tip of my brush to kind of paint, to draw where I want these mountain ranges to go. So I just kind of pushed up in each spot to use the tip of my brush to make it kind of pointy. We're gonna go for some big mountains for this exercise. So I've made the whole mountains out of just a wash, a basic smooth layer of color. So it's all wet, it's all watery, and I've made 3 big pokes basically. So I'm gonna let that one dry, and I'm gonna create myself 3 separate areas to do practices on today. I'm gonna do the next one with some brown, because why not? It's kind of an orangey brown, so it's a little warmer than I normally would like, but hey, it's fine. Same thing, I'm gonna do maybe I'll do kind of different sizes because it's good to practice with different things. So there I've got 3. So after I draw the pokes, I'm just gonna fill in the bottom and kind of let it fade down to nothing. This is the lightest value. We need to be able to get darker. So this is almost even darker than I would have liked it. So try to keep your value very, very light, and then it's easier for us to add those dark shadows the lighter our first layer is. All right, I'm gonna do one more in purple. Down here, we're gonna do a nice, really big, and then maybe some small ones over here. Again, nice and watery, and then just fill in that space underneath those triangular forms. Doesn't matter if it's perfectly smooth either, because mountains have texture. Even though we're doing it as one brush stroke, so to speak, if your paint dries and does some cool, watercolory effects, don't worry about it. It'll still look really nice in the end. Okay, I do need these to be dry for what comes next. So I'm gonna be using a heat gun. This is just a heat gun I got on Amazon. A hair dryer works too if you have that on hand, but it just heats up the paper and the air and it makes it dry faster. So I'm gonna do that quick. Okay, they are all dry. Here is where we're gonna learn to add those shadows. I'm gonna switch to a smaller brush. I'm gonna switch to my 6 here, just so I have a bit more control. We don't want as much water in our paintbrush. The big thing about sizes with paintbrushes is how much water do you want it to hold. So if you need a whole area to be painted before it dries, you go with a bigger brush. If you don't need that, go with a smaller brush. And of course, detail size and whatnot. So this next part is very crucial, but it can be a little bit confusing. So I'm gonna try to explain it and of course do it as well, but it might take a few watches for you to catch on. So don't worry if you're like, wait, what? Stay with me, give it a second watch through, you'll get it. So each of these peaks of the mountain, we need to imagine some lines at the peaks and the valleys. Now we're gonna pick a side, left or right, to make our shadow. I'm gonna be doing all of my shadows on the left today, which means I'm gonna imagine a line from the peak that comes down and connects to the left valley. If there is no valley, then it starts the peak and it comes down and it just connects to the edge. Now this section is the shadow. So we're imagining that wherever we put the shadow is kind of the back of the mountain, and the sun or the moon, whatever light source, is hitting the front of the mountain. That's what's gonna stay light, because in watercolor, we work from light to dark. So let me show you what I mean. I'm gonna get a darker value of what I used before, so a little bit more paint on my brush, and I'm gonna start at the peak, and I like to do this with a wiggly line or a zigzag, and I'm gonna come down, and then I'm gonna come back up to the valley, and then I'm just gonna fill in that section. That's one side. I'm gonna do it again. I'm gonna start at the peak. I'm gonna come down and back over to the valley with kind of a wiggly zigzagged line. Now, the more random you make this line, that's fine. This is defining where the edge of the mountain is. So however funky that line looks, now we have the face of the mountain, the back of the mountain, the face of the mountain, the back of the mountain. Now, when it does get to this valley, I do like to sometimes kind of create a bit of a curve where it's kind of echoing that, where that curve would go up to the next mountain, because this direction is gonna make it feel like it kind of goes back up. Every stroke we make shows the direction of the surface of the object that we're painting. Now, I'm gonna do it again for this third peak, starting at the peak and then going over kind of just to the side. Now, there's a few things we can do. We can leave it like this, totally fine, or we can start to play with how they connect to each other. So what if these shadows actually came all the way over and connected with these shadows? Look how that pushed this center mountain closer to us, because now it's in front of, and this highlight is behind the mountain. So just connecting these shadows in different ways creates a lot of different effects. This is something that takes a lot of playing with to kind of get the effect you're looking for. Maybe even without painting a peak, I could invent another peak by creating the shadow that would be on the back of it. So now I know that there's a front to a mountain over there, and then this is the back of it. Now later I'll have to add in another bit of value, but see how adding those shadows starts to define the shape of the mountain. Now they're all a little bit different value. They're kind of, my paint is drying at different speeds. That's totally fine. The surface of the mountain might have different textures on it. In the end, we're gonna need at least 3 values. So I'm gonna take this shadow value and I'm gonna use it to make a few shadows on the front of the mountain as well. And I'm just gonna create a few little wiggly lines, but the direction of these lines is important. I'm placing them in a diagonal so that it feels like the mountain is, the face of it is coming down towards us. These are quite sheer cliffs, but most of the mountain is light. Now, once our shadow dries, we can do the same thing with an even darker value on the back, but I'm moving kind of fast. So I'm gonna slow down and we're gonna try this again with the next mountain. So basic idea, we're connecting the peak to the valley. Let's do that again with our brown mountain. So I'm gonna again put more brown on my paintbrush. If you hear a growl, that is, and a bark. I have a very noisy puppy right now, so my apologies. He'll settle down again shortly. So we're gonna start at the peak. This time, I'm gonna kind of do the line, almost have it go forward and then kind of back up to the valley, just to see how that is different. It kind of shifts the direction that the mountain is facing. And I really like the idea that maybe this small one is actually closer to us. So I'm gonna do that thing where I connect the shadows again, because it feels like then they're kind of in a row. Actually, what if I did that to all of my mountains? Look how now we are almost behind the mountains in this setup, because we've connected all of our shadows and the lightest is all seeming to face away from us. It gives us a whole different perspective. So just shifting where those shadows go, you can make a big difference, but the idea is still the same. Peak to valley, peak to valley. But in this case, you're just going past the valley and connecting to the next one. All right, let's do the same shadows on our purple one. Again, I'm just adding a little more paint to my paintbrush. Peak. This one I'm just gonna go classic because I keep going beyond what I'm telling you to do. Peak to valley, peak to valley. And peak. We're gonna zigzag it to valley. Okay, and then, again, I forgot to do this on the brown one. We're just gonna go to the front with the same value. This is basically the darkest shadows on the front of our mountain. I'm being very random again. I'm making some little marks, I'm making some big marks, but in general, all those marks are a little bit of a diagonal. They're parallel to this outside edge of the mountain. That again makes it feel like this sort of sheer cliff. I'm gonna go back to my brown mountain and just add those as well. Even though we can't see as much of the highlight, there should still be some texture. This is basically, we're creating texture on the rocks of these mountains. Okay, I'm gonna dry all of these and we're gonna add our third value. Okay, so we're gonna have one even darker value on each mountain to show the texture on the shadowy side. So we use the same value to do the texture on the light side, but on the dark side of our mountains, we also want some texture in areas where it's even darker. So again, we're going diagonal. Look how I'm following the angle of the side of the mountain. Some are little marks, some are even bigger, some might feel like a whole new shadow, but with just a darker value of the same color, I'm going in and adding those shadows. So that pushes it even further, gives me value on both the light and the dark side. I do that to my brown mountain as well. And on the back, this one, the back is most of it. So we especially want to make it interesting to look at. So I'm definitely gonna add some nice shadows. Again, I'm following the side that the shadow touches. So this one, there's a lot of shadow. So wait a second, do I follow this side or that side? Because the shadow touches the left of the mountains, we're using that diagonal to guide our texture, because that's where it's sloping down and making that effect. I'm, again, being kind of loose. Sometimes I'm pressing the whole side of my brush down to really fuzz and fade it. Sometimes I'm using the very tip of my brush to get a more precise dark line. The more you play, the more comfortable you will get. And just stay loose. Watercolor is good at being loose and random. So if you can stay loose and random, that's great. Then that helps you achieve that same effect in watercolor. Last mountain is my purple guy down here. Same thing, following that diagonal on the side. Now, how could we push these mountains even further? Basically, you just keep repeating these steps and you layer. So instead of only trying to have 3 values, which was our goal, you could try to have 5 values. The more variety you have, the more interesting it will be. So if we look at my mountain here, I have not only multiple values, but also some multiple hues. So there's blues, also some grays. We've got almost 3 different shadows on this white surface of the mountain. So we just stopped after the most basic step. That's what these ones are here. But the more you practice those layers, the more you can really push your mountain to feel like it has texture. So one thing I like to do as well is I like to use pen to outline it. It gives this really interesting illustrative look, and it's also gonna help me remind you what we just did. So I'm gonna dry it, and then I'm gonna review the steps we did and outline it with pen to really highlight those angles and lines and textures. Okay, time to use pen. Let's review. First, we learned to connect the shadows from the peak to the valley. So we started by making our kind of zigzag wobbly line down the middle of the mountain. Now, when I use pen, I'm not trying to be super exact because it's kind of fun to just let it be loose and follow the shape of the shadow. But we started with the peak down kind of towards the center, and then we wiggled it back over to the valley. So I'm gonna do that with my pen to just kind of show the edge. Now, this pen is not working, so let me try a new one. There we go. So I'll follow even the outside edge of the mountains, but you'll see how these center lines from the peak down were kind of zigzag. In general, if you did a plain zigzag, it would still look great. A little bit of a random zigzag is even better because it just makes it feel less constructed and a little more natural, because real rocks don't, follow an exact zigzag pattern. Then once we created our areas of shadow, we put some shadow on the highlight side. So we created these areas of basically carved out rocks. There are areas where the rock on the mountain is kind of dented, or there's something obstructing the light source. It just gives it a bit more of that texture. So when I'm illustrating with pen, I like to go and outline some of these to, again, give that kind of contrast. And this is kind of like adding another layer of shadow. So I said how you can push your mountain further by layering even more and adding more value, I'm kind of adding a fourth value with my lines because the black is the darker than everything else. So it's kind of, I like to call it cheating because it's fun to call it cheating, but it's not. It's just another tool that you can use to make it happen. Now, when we got to the valleys, we tried to keep it a little bit looser and kind of curved. So these valleys, it'd be nice if these lines kind of curved up towards the other part of the mountain. Now, if you forgot to do a step like that, which I talked about it up here and then didn't really think about it down here, the nice thing about the pen is you can kind of fake it. You can put those curves and those lines in where they maybe weren't originally. So I can think about how it might connect to the rest of the mountain by just kind of fudging and making those lines look the way I wish they did. So that's another nice way to make it the way you want it. We've added shadows on both sides. So even after we did shadows on the highlight side, we also went back to the shadow side and added even darker values because again, we want to show that there's texture even when it's in shadow because it's not purely black. You can still see, there's still some reflecting light from whatever the light source is. So we can still see bits of it. So I'm just going to go around and kind of trace a few of those shadows to make them easier to see and stand out. And that's going to help me notice where those things are happening. Now, if you don't like the look of the black lines, that's totally fine. Just think of this as how I'm showing you what we did and you can stop after watercolor. If you enjoy the black lines, then great, you can do that. I like to use these micron pens. They're waterproof, so if I did do any lines and decided to go back and paint more, it would not bleed or smudge. So check your pen for waterproofness before you paint on top of it. And I think it's just nice to use all the time because then, again, if you do change your mind and you want to go back and add something or do something different, you don't have to worry about it bleeding. Sometimes I will draw before I paint if I want it to look like something exactly. A lot of my own art that I make and sell are familiar places from the state that I live in. And so I need it to look familiar. I need it to look like the spot that I was inspired by. So I will draw with pencil, I'll draw with pen, I'll erase the pencil, and then I'll finally paint afterwards because I can't erase paint, but I can erase my pencil when I'm first starting and planning the piece of art. So try some different things. Try drawing beforehand, try drawing afterwards. It's kind of different looks, different purposes, but it all goes really well. If you are looking to paint more often, I would suggest checking out my course in the description below that's called Creating Your Watercolor Habit. The more often you paint, the more confident you'll become, the more these kind of techniques will just become natural to you. And that course has got 30 at least. Sometimes I add more, so it depends on when I made this video. Right now it has 30 tutorials for you to follow along that are all super quick and easy and build your skills. So I hope you enjoyed learning mountains with me today. I hope that you have some practical things you can take away, like the peak to valley, the zigzag lines, and adding shadows to both faces of the mountain. I would challenge you to turn it into a landscape next. So take your mountain, add a foreground, add a sky, have a lot of fun with it. Mountains are always gorgeous and it's kind of hard to go wrong. So happy painting and I'll see you in the next video.